People tend to split mythology into two camps. Either it's pure fiction, or it's a real event, with a little extra flair thrown in. But when you actually dig into Greek mythology, you start to realize the world doesn't divide that cleanly. Some myths gained a shadow of reality the moment archaeologists pulled a city out of the ground. Some monsters were never real, but the fear that created them absolutely was. And some heroes feel less like actual individuals and more like an entire era's worth of pain and longing compressed into a single name. So today, I want to reframe the question. Not whether Greek mythology was true, but why people chose to remember reality in the shape of these stories. And how much of that memory can we still trace today? We'll follow the thread through Troy, Odysseus, King Minos and his labyrinth, Heracles, and the Amazons. And by the end, we won't land on the conclusion that mythology was literally true. We'll land on something more interesting than that. The idea that myth was never a lie. It was the form human memory took when reality became too enormous to carry any other way. Let's start with Troy, because in a lot of ways, Troy is where all of this begins. For a long time, people treated the Trojan War as pure literature. And honestly, it's easy to see why. The most beautiful woman in the world. A love affair that launches 1,000 ships. Champions clashing on a burning plain. And then, at the very end, a giant wooden horse. It's almost too perfect, too structured, too symbolic, too cinematic to feel like something that actually unfolded in the messy, unpredictable way real events do. For a while, some people even argued that Troy itself was an imaginary stage. Then excavations changed everything. Under a hillside in what is now Turkey, layer after layer of cities were found stacked on top of one another, each one built on the ruins of the last. There were thick defensive walls, a location overlooking the narrow passage between the sea and the interior. The kind of position that matters enormously to traders, to tax collectors, and to anyone looking to control the region by force. And in some of those layers, there are clear signs of destruction. Sudden fires, evidence of defensive preparations, signs of weapons being used, the unmistakable feeling not of a city going about its daily life, but of a city bracing for something it couldn't survive. Now, none of that proves the Trojan War happened the way Homer told it. We can't confirm the duel between Achilles and Hector. We can't verify the horse. But one thing becomes undeniable. A significant, strategically important city existed here. At some point, it suffered severe destruction. And that event had exactly the kind of weight that eventually gets turned into a great war story. Troy isn't a case of myth becoming real. It's the other way around. Reality became myth. Someone stood in front of those walls. Someone watched them burn. Someone carried that memory forward. Over time, the event got shaped, the emotions got amplified, and the defeat and vengeance found their way into a hero's name. The truth of Troy isn't in the wooden horse. It's in the scorched city underneath it. But here's the important thing. Troy being real doesn't automatically make every other Greek myth real alongside it. If anything, Troy raises the bar. There's a big difference between a real place existing and every story told about that place being factual. With that distinction in mind, the next figure gets even more interesting. That's Odysseus. And honestly, Odysseus is harder to pin down. Troy at least left behind walls and ash. Odysseus drifts across the sea, encountering monsters, creatures who lure men to their ruin with song. A one-eyed giant who traps him in a cave, one impossible adventure after another. On the surface, he looks like the most fictional character of the lot. And yet, in a strange way, he also feels like the most human. Because at the core of everything Odysseus does, he's just trying to get home. That's it. Out of all the heroes in Greek mythology, he's the one defined not by conquest or godlike strength, but by endurance. By the refusal to stop. The island said to be his home actually exists. And from that place, traces emerge across the centuries of people who remembered him, who honored him, who left offerings connected to his name. That doesn't confirm a historical king named Odysseus ruled there, but it tells us something just as meaningful. To the people who lived on that island and to the travelers Who came after, Odysseus wasn't just a made-up story. He was a center of memory. A model for a certain kind of life. A symbol for everyone who crosses the water and has to find their way back. This is where it's easy to jump to the wrong conclusion. When you find a name carved into an old stone, the instinct is to say, confirmed, he was real. But the more careful reading is actually more fascinating. Ancient people treated Odysseus as a figure from a believable past. They saw their own lives reflected in his story. That makes sense when you think about what life in that world actually looked like. You go to war across the sea. Getting home is not simple. You hit storms. You lose your bearing. You wash up on coasts you don't recognize. You face people who don't speak your language and don't want you there. You keep going anyway, because the alternative is worse. It's entirely plausible that the experiences of hundreds of sailors and soldiers, over generations, all flowed into the name Odysseus. The giant in the cave might not be a real monster, but it could easily be a very real hostile stranger, encountered on an unknown shore. The dangerous song that pulls men off course could be the name given to whatever stretch of sea was notorious for swallowing ships. The years of wandering before finally reaching home could speak to every veteran who found that surviving the war was only the beginning of the journey. Odysseus looks less like one man and more like the face of an entire era, defined by crossing water and trying to survive it. We can't prove a specific person, but the reality that shaped him? That was absolutely there. And there's one more layer worth noting. Certain details buried in these old epics, particular tools, particular customs, particular ways of doing things, line up with the material culture of a genuinely ancient period. The stories are full of fantasy, but their roots reach down into something old and specific. This isn't the kind of thing someone invents on a whim. It points to memories being passed down orally for a very long time before they finally settled into the stories we know. So with Odysseus, the sharpest question isn't real or fake. It's this: when reality gets turned into song and passed down through generations, how far can it travel from where it started? Now we go to Crete. This is where people's favorite image comes in. King Minos, the labyrinth, the creature at the center of it, part human, part bull. This story has a grip that hasn't loosened in thousands of years. Someone goes into an impossible maze, faces what lives inside it, and follows a thread back out into the light. Even told plainly, it hits hard. What's remarkable is what was actually found on Crete. There was a real Bronze Age civilization there, and it left behind a palace complex of extraordinary scale. Dozens of rooms, long corridors branching off in multiple directions, storage chambers, staircases, open courts, narrow passages. Looking at the layout even today, it's not hard to understand why someone approaching that place from the outside might struggle to describe it as anything other than a maze. On top of that, the culture surrounding this palace appears to have placed enormous significance on the bull. Bull imagery appears repeatedly, in decoration, in painting, in the traces of ritual. Put an overwhelming architectural complex together with an intense, recurring symbol of the bull, and by the time the memory reaches someone a generation or two removed, the ingredients for a monster in a labyrinth are already there. The Minotaur almost certainly wasn't a living creature, but a strange, powerful, wealthy civilization that was genuinely difficult to understand. From the outside, that existed. Humans have a habit of remembering what they don't understand in the shape of a monster. We still do it today. The same goes for Minos himself. Pinning down a single king by that name is difficult, but Crete as a dominant maritime power, that cast a long shadow over the surrounding world. The archaeology fits that picture surprisingly well. What makes the mythology especially pointed is the relationship with Athens. In the story, Athenian young people are sent to Crete as tribute, fed to the creature in the labyrinth, until Theseus finally kills the monster and ends the arrangement. You can read that as a monster-slaying tale. You can also read it as a memory of subjugation, a story of being under the weight of a stronger power, reframed later as a moment of heroic liberation. In other words, the Minotaur might not have been a real monster. It might have been the face given to a real power that once felt monstrous to face. And that brings us to a principle that runs through almost all of this. The monsters in myths are often not real animals. They're real forces, given a shape people could point to. The labyrinth might be an alien palace. The monster might be an alien order. And the thread that guides someone back out might be the closest thing to understanding that was available to someone who felt completely lost inside a world they hadn't built and didn't control. People didn't invent these creatures just for entertainment. They invented them to give form to something overwhelming that they had actually experienced. Which brings us to Heracles. Heracles does too much. He kills an impossibly powerful lion with his bare hands. He accomplishes tasks that no ordinary person could complete. He travels to the ends of the earth and fights things that shouldn't exist. By any surface reading, he's the most unrealistic figure we've looked at so far. But the most outsized heroes are rarely invented from nothing. Heracles looks less like a biography and more like a convergence. One region might have had a warrior famous for bringing down a dangerous animal. Another might have remembered a man who solved a massive engineering problem by redirecting a river. A third might have told stories of a powerful fighter who went on a distant campaign and never came back. Over centuries of retelling, those separate stories begin to merge. Eventually they become one figure, and that figure has to be extraordinary enough to hold all of them at once. So asking whether Heracles was real might be slightly the wrong question. A better one is this: why did so many stories from so many places flow toward a single name? Probably because some problems are too big to attach to an ordinary person. When a community faces something catastrophic, something beyond the scale of what one generation can explain or process, the story needs a container large enough to hold it. Heracles becomes the place where all of it goes. The ideals people demanded of themselves, the strength they wished they had, the violence they both feared and relied on, the idea that suffering could be meaningful, that labor could lead somewhere, that even catastrophic mistakes might eventually be redeemed. Heracles can't be confirmed as a specific person, but as evidence of how enormous the demands placed on human beings can become. He's one of the most vivid things mythology has ever produced. He's not a man who existed. He's the sum total of what an entire society needed someone to be. And underneath that is something worth sitting with. Why are heroes always beyond human scale? Probably because the problems they carry are beyond human scale too. A community facing disaster, a threat from outside, chaos from within, something too large and too frightening to hold in plain language. Those things get handed to a single figure in a story. Heracles is as strong as he is not because a person was actually that strong, but because the weight of what he was asked to carry genuinely was. Heroes are born out of the size of what needs to be faced. And then there are the Amazons. For a long time, the Amazons read as pure invention. A society of warrior women living without men, riding horses, drawing bows, appearing at the edges of the known world as something threatening and strange and almost impossible to categorize. The image was so vivid and so neat that it seemed like the kind of thing someone simply made up to fill in the blank spaces on a map. Then burial sites began surfacing across the steppes to the north and east. And the story got more complicated. Women buried with weapons. Women whose remains showed the physical marks of a lifetime on horseback. Women whose graves were arranged in ways that pointed toward lives closely tied to combat and the hunt. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic discovery, but steadily, consistently, across a wide region. Does that mean the Amazon kingdom of legend existed? No, but it does make it harder to say that. The Greeks were simply inventing something from nothing. A more likely picture is this: Greek travelers and soldiers encountered people who lived very differently from anything they knew. Among those people were women who fought, who hunted, who rode. To Greek eyes, that was genuinely disorienting. Their own world had clear ideas about what women did and didn't do. And this shattered those ideas. The disorientation produced exaggeration. The exaggeration produced legend. And the legend eventually produced the Amazons. The Amazons aren't a lie. They're an extreme translation of a reality. That a particular society didn't have the framework to process straight. That's a deeply human response. When we encounter a way of life that challenges everything we assume to be normal, we rarely describe it plainly. We make it bigger, stranger, and more absolute than it probably was. The truth of the Amazons isn't in the details of a matriarchal warrior nation. It's in the fact that the strength of women in other cultures was real enough and striking enough to shake an entire tradition into producing a myth of that magnitude. After going through all of this one by one, the conclusion turns out to be simpler than expected. Greek mythology is not entirely true. It is also not entirely made up. Troy was a real city, but the war that destroyed it passed through centuries of poetic retelling before it reached us. Odysseus can't be confirmed as a single king, but the accumulated memory of countless sea crossings and painful homecomings is absolutely real. The Minotaur was almost certainly not a living creature, but it looks very much like the shape a powerful and alien civilization took in the minds of people who feared and resented it. Heracles looks less like one man and more like a vast shadow, cast by the heroic ideals of multiple eras layered on top of each other. And the Amazons are an overstatement, but the reality of women who fought and rode at the edge of the Greek world is becoming harder and harder to dismiss. The best way to read a myth, then, is not to fact-check it. It's to ask what reality gave birth to it. Asking whether the monster was real tells you less than asking why people needed to remember that particular reality as a monster. This is where things get genuinely important. We tend to think facts are all that matter. And facts do matter, but humans don't live by facts alone. We also live by what those facts leave behind in us after they pass through our emotions. Who fought whom, what fell and when, who was honored on which island. Those things make up the record. But what those events meant to people, why a story survived for centuries past the civilization that produced it, why a community transforms a defeat into a heroic tragedy, why a stranger becomes a monster, why the people who never came home are given a hero's name. Myth captures all of that in a way that a bare record never could. In that sense, myth isn't the opposite of truth. It's the form truth takes when it survives inside the human heart. The truth of Troy isn't simply that walls came down. It's the terror of realizing that a world which seems permanent can be gone in a single night. The truth of Odysseus isn't whether he actually met a giant. It's how long the desire to go home can keep a person alive. The truth of the labyrinth isn't in the floor plan of an ancient palace. It's the feeling of being completely lost inside a system of power you didn't build and cannot read. The truth of Heracles isn't whether a person could be that strong. It's that communities have always found ways to load the weight of their age onto a single set of shoulders, because that's one way to make the unbearable feel survivable. And the truth of the Amazons isn't in the legend's details. It's that an unfamiliar kind of power, when it's real enough to unsettle an entire worldview, tends to come back as myth. When I look at Greek mythology, I don't see the debris of a mistaken way of understanding the world. I see the oldest method humans developed for interpreting a reality too large to face directly. We can't hold onto raw experience for long. War is too brutal. The sea is too wide. Loss lasts too long. Strangers are too strange. So we transform it. We give things names. We build monsters to hold our fear. We build heroes to hold our hope. We bring in the gods to explain what we can't explain ourselves. And we wrap all of it in a story, because that's the only shape it can take that we can actually carry. Myth is not a lie. It is the technology humans use to bring pain down to a scale where it can be spoken about. And what makes archaeology so fascinating, in this context, is that it keeps pulling fragments of the underlying reality back into the light. A layer of ash and burned debris. A name found somewhere unexpected. A palace complex more intricate than any outsider could navigate. A woman buried with her weapons. Traces of equipment from a world far older than the stories that reference it. Each of these things says the same thing. The people who told these stories weren't making things up randomly. They couldn't reproduce reality accurately. But the impact that reality left on them? They preserved that with striking precision. Maybe that's exactly why Greek mythology still pulls at us the way it does. These are old stories, but they don't feel distant. Because the things they're actually about aren't ancient at all. We still take complex realities and reduce them to simple narratives. We still turn people we don't understand into symbols. We still ask one person to carry the anxiety of an entire era. We still build stories around our losses. Because it's the only way to get through them. The heroes just have different names now. The monsters just have different faces. Reading Greek mythology isn't really an act of looking back at a remote past. It's closer to watching a recording of how humans process reality, how we remember it, how we distort it, how we endure it. Through Troy, we see how people hold onto the memory of catastrophic loss. Through Odysseus, we see how powerfully the desire to return home can shape a life. Through the labyrinth, we see the particular vertigo of being inside a power structure you didn't choose and can't comprehend. Through Heracles, we see why every era manufactures its own version of the hero it needs. And through the Amazons, we see how quickly an encounter with genuine difference can harden into legend. In the end, the most important question isn't whether Greek mythology was true. It's why, thousands of years later, we can still smell reality in these stories. I think the answer is clear. Myth is the second form of truth. The first form is the event itself. The second form is the wound and the longing the event leaves behind. Cities fall, wars end, people die, names disappear. But the fear felt in those moments, and the grief, and the shame, and the hope, those survive in story form. That's why myth is less precise than a factual record, but sometimes reveals more about what it means to be human than any record could. Not who did what, but what people were afraid of. What they couldn't let go of. What they wanted to call a hero. That is why Greek mythology is still alive. Not as a museum piece. As an old habit of the human mind, still in use. And that's probably why we'll keep asking the same question. How much of this is really myth? Until we arrive, eventually, at the only answer that fully satisfies. The question that matters isn't how much of it is fiction. It's why certain truths could only ever be told in the shape of a myth.